Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Adjacent but Only Just by Nichole Van, narrated by Mhairi Morrison. God answers sharp and sudden on some prayers, and thrusts the thing we have prayed for in our face, a gauntlet with a gift in it. Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Ah, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? Robert Browning. Prologue. Manchester, England, August 1843. Viola Brodure could not scoff in the face of death. But then she struggled to speak in her actual life, so the realization was hardly a surprise. The destitute woman seated before her, however, scoffed and spoke with ease. "I hope I die with grace." Martha chuckled breathlessly, rocking her sick babe in her arms. "Heaven knows I have a dreadful lot to atone for." She spared a glance for Viola, as if anticipating words of comfort. Viola's tongue froze, anxiety and asthma tightening her breathing and choking off any reply. "Hopefully, death shall not visit you any time soon, Martha." Mrs. Eloise Carpenter, Viola's cousin, soothed before the silence stretched too thin. Today, Viola and Eloise had ventured into the heart of the ironically named Angel Meadow slum of Manchester, wishing to further Eloise's charity work. "Aye, we're no dead yet." Martha touched her babe's fevered cheek. "'Tis a fine line around here between life and death, and we walk that line like Mr. Fredericks from downstairs after a bottle of gin. None too straight, with mounds of off-key singing." Again she glanced at Viola, again anticipating a reaction, a smile, a chuckle, something. But the caustic coal smoke, combined with Viola's asthmatic lungs and shy nervousness, ensured her lips remained shut. Granted, the dingy sleeping mat on the floor and solitary table piled with dirty crockery already spoke volumes. Despite the forced cheerfulness of Martha's words, death hovered in the corners and lurked outside the flat's rickety door. Giving Viola a tight, understanding look, Eloise turned back to the baby in Martha's arms, pressing a hand to his forehead. Shame flushed Viola's skin, which only served to bind her chest tighter and stuff her mouth full of cotton. Oof! Her asthma and anxiety were a vicious cycle. "Just speak," she pleaded with her brain. "Simply open your mouth." If she were sitting at a desk, the words would flow easily from her pen. But even then, mere words felt hollow in the face of Martha's suffering, a woman whose husband had abandoned her and their 5 children, children who crouched around their mother and stared at Viola with sunken eyes. Their mean circumstances were a far cry from Viola's own at the Vicar's Manse in Westacre, the rural Wiltshire village where she lived with her father. Viola's visit with cousin Eloise was to have been an uneventful one, a relaxing holiday enjoying the social whirl of Manchester. But Eloise was passionate about addressing the ills of the poor laws, and so, instead of making morning calls and attending garden luncheons, Viola trailed her cousin through crumbling tenements and rookeries. 2 of Eloise's sturdiest grooms accompanied them, ensuring their safety. Before this week, Viola had understood that abject poverty existed, that, at times, people had to make difficult choices to survive. But nothing could have truly prepared her for the harsh reality of Angel Meadows. Rats feasting on the body of a dead man, a woman screaming in agony as a man beat her, rag-clad children who snatched chunks of bread from Viola's hand with skeletal fingers. The touted Poor Law Amendment of 1834 had failed them all. "More must be done, cousin," Eloise had said that morning. "Consider using your voice to advocate for true change. Your readers will listen, just as Mr. Dickens do. I am sure of it." As if picking up the thread of Viola's thoughts, Martha smiled tentatively at her. "I cannot wait to tell my neighbours that the famous Miss Brodure visited me today." Viola's breath hitched, her fingers knotting. Every eye in the room turned to her, watching, waiting. She implored herself to say something, a simple phrase like, "Martha, I admire how you confront your struggles with such grace." Instead, she stood motionless, a frozen rabbit of a person. It was intolerable, unconscionable. "You've read my cousin's works, then?" Eloise asked. "Aye," Martha nodded. "Mr. Frederick's downstairs has a copy of Little Lottie, and he can read, he can. He's already read it to us twice." "Caw, Lottie was right plucky, standing up to her wicked aunt like that," a girl at Martha's shoulder said, gaunt eyes wide. Eloise gave Viola a look that said, "Say something. You cannot disappoint a child." Viola swallowed. Thank you," she managed to stammer. "That is very kind." Viola wrote moralizing stories about pious orphans and virtuous maidens who held to their principles even under trying circumstances, characters who saw the world in crisp shades of black and white. But after everything Viola had witnessed this morning, writing about pious orphans felt ridiculous. Orphans, she knew now, did not have the luxury of piety. In the tiny tenement room, hung with filthy linen and stinking of unwashed bodies and mildew, Viola faced the reality of her own inadequacies. Not just her asthmatic lungs and nervously stammering tongue. No, it was her silence, spoken and written, her inaction. Because even though her prim tales were beloved the country over, they did nothing to measurably improve the lives of others. Abruptly, she saw herself from above, a mute, marble statue in the centre of the room, silence and indecision damning her. Eloise, however, had scarcely ceased moving, touching the babe, laughing with Martha, smiling at the other children, speaking gentle words of comfort. Shame flooded Viola's chest. She needed to act. She should be writing stories that mattered, stories that challenged traditional notions, not reinforced them, stories that demanded change. Resolve burned within her, a primal vow beating in time with her heart. Never again would she be a rigid bystander. Never again would she remain silent in the face of another's suffering. Upon returning to Eloise's townhouse, Viola retreated to her bedchamber. But the elegant room was too much, too lovely with its fine linens, Italian wallpaper and velvet curtains, too warm with its cheery fire, too comfortable with its feather-stuffed cushions, thick Savonnerie carpet and pillowy bed-tick. Unable to face her own hypocrisy, she slid down the wall beside the bed, sinking onto the hard floor, her head resting against the wooden panelling. Her lungs felt tight. She bit her trembling bottom lip and stared up at the pretty yellow chintz bed curtains. After a moment, her eyes drifted to the book of poetry on her bedside table. Poems from the Highlands, by Ethan Penn-Leith. Though they had never met, Viola admired Mr. Penn-Leith intensely. He was one of the most celebrated poets of their day, praising the moors and braes of the Scottish Highlands with such skill that even the Queen lauded his work. His first and only book accompanied Viola everywhere, a comforting symphony of rhythm and profundity. Her hand reached for the slim volume, the well-loved pages opening to her favourite poem, adjacent, but only just. I am adjacent, but only just, a falcon's flight away, from feral moor and heathered scent, a prisoner of the malcontent, of life lived in delay. I am adjacent, but only just. Viola reread the familiar words, a fingertip tracing over the lines. The poem described Mr. Penn-Leith's life as the son of a Scottish gentleman farmer, a man working in the shadow of the Highlands, adjacent to wildness, but never part of it. The lines were heralded as a metaphor for modern life, the separation of humans from the natural world, a desire to seek truth in nature instead of simply living in sight of it. Adjacent, but only just. Mr. Penn-Leith's poem profoundly summarised Viola's life. A native shyness, anxious nervousness, and unpredictable asthma caused her to approach life with too much temerity. Adjacent, but only just. Adjacent to action and true living, adjacent to revolutionary ideas and words, adjacent to marriage and children. Hers was a life lived in delay. Viola was so very weary of it, of spending her days metaphorically immobile in the centre of a room, knowing she needed to act, to do, to move, but somehow not. She swallowed and looked back up at the bed curtains, their sunny lemon cheer taunting her newfound sense of purpose, reminding her that other forces also influenced her pen, her father and his reliance on the Duke of Kendal foremost among them. The elderly, tyrannical Duke of Kendal would be apoplectic were he to learn of Viola's current mindset. And given that Kendal funded her father's living as Vicar of Westacre, well, to incur the wrath of her father's employer would be the very height of folly. But surely there was something she could do, some way to untether the fierce creature that stretched restless inside her. An idea formed in her head. 2 ideas, actually. Viola pushed up from the floor, slowly standing. Did she dare? She darted another glance at Mr. Penn-Leith's book of poetry. Why, yes, she rather thought she did. She crossed the room to her small desk and reached for her pen and notebook. The London Tatler, February 14, 1844. Gentle reader, we here at the Tatler have one burning question. Will Mr. Ethan Penn-Leith and Miss Viola Brodure make a match of it? Few can dispute the popularity and romanticism of Mr. Penn-Leith, our own Highland poet. Why, just last month he strolled down Bond Street in his customary great kilt, turning heads and causing several young ladies to swoon. Is it any wonder he is often compared to Lord Byron? Similarly, all of London is well acquainted with the popularity of Miss Brodure's novels. Speculation continues regarding her latest book, Polly Pettifer, and its now infamous Chapter 11, in which Miss Brodure, using Polly as her mouthpiece, proclaims the brilliance of Mr. Penn-Leith. Now that Mr. Penn-Leith has returned home to Scotland to complete his second book of poetry, we wait with bated breath to see if he will reply to Miss Brodure's overtures in a similarly literary fashion. On this Valentine's Day, when we celebrate love, we hold out hope that the two literary giants of our age will write a romantic tale of their own. 1. Hawthorne, principal seat of the Duke of Kendal, Wiltshire, England, March 1844. Viola had not anticipated that her marriage would be decided by committee, namely, an autocratic duke, an elderly baroness, and her father, all ruthlessly plotting Viola's nuptials and writing career over the fish course of all things. "An August wedding, I should think," Lady Whipple was saying from one end of the dining-room table, leaning sideways as a footman slid a generous slice of trout in aspic onto her plate. "With her fair colouring, Miss Brodure should be a summer bride." "An excellent suggestion," Dr. Brodure replied at Viola's side, "though September might be better for my Viola to wed Mr. Ethan Penn-Leith. There is much to accomplish between now and then." Her father shot her a quick smile. His grey hair stuck out in soft tufts above his ears, lending him an owlish appearance that tugged at her heart. Viola attempted a weak smile in return. Her own face surely looked akin to a blacksmith's forge, fiery red and scorching. Her heart certainly picked up the metaphor, hammering in her chest with punishing force. Worse, her lungs threatened rebellion, her breathing tight. As usual, nerves and tension aggravated her asthma, and her current situation was the definition of nerve-wracking tension. Taking in a shallow breath, Viola gathered her courage and steadied her shaking hands. "If I may offer an opinion," she said, attempting to control the wheezing warble in her voice, "I should prefer to actually meet my prospective groom and, well, become acquainted, conduct a courtship, ascertain if we have affection for one another, and so forth, before planning our nuptials." Her halting words dampened the enthusiasm in the room for approximately 4 seconds. "September is an excellent month for a wedding," the young Duke of Kendal intoned from the head of the table, swirling his wine-glass and nodding toward his aunt, Lady Whipple. "Miss Brodure should marry Mr. Penn-Leith then." Though tall and imposing, His Grace had inherited his late father's propensity to grey early in life. His salt-and-pepper hair more closely resembled a gentleman in his 60th year of life, not his 23rd. Viola found the contrast between the Duke's grey hair, dark eyes, and youthful face rather unnerving. Granted, everything about dining at Hawthorne was unnerving, from the lavishly gilded mirrors on each wall to the 8 footmen in starched livery standing at attention behind her dining-room chair. Even the fish on her plate, the trout's glassy eyeballs jiggling in their jelly casing, disconcerted her. Viola had a strong aversion to aspic. It felt unnatural to suspend an entire fish in gelatin, hovering in mid-air, fixed and unmoving. Much, she supposed, as her life at present. Frozen, caught in a net, only some of which was of her own making. "I hear the Queen herself has given her seal of approval to a match between Miss Brodure and Mr. Penn-Leith," Lady Whipple said, poking at her own fish with a fork. Her ladyship had been in residence at Hawthorne, seeing to the Duke's household and acting as hostess, for as long as Viola had lived in Westacre. Lady Portman said as much at the Duchess of Buccleuch's soirée. And, as Her Majesty's Lady of the Bedchamber, Lady Portman would certainly know. The Queen was in on this plot, too. Viola pressed a hand against her stomach, her lungs spasming. What was she to do? Truly, she should have foreseen this. The broadsheets loved Ethan Penn-Leith. The sweeping romanticism of his poetry, the handsome virility of his person. The papers regularly printed a lithograph portrait of him. A large man in a great kilt, square-jawed, with tousled curls, a glint of humour in his eyes. Was it any wonder the Scot was so celebrated? Was it any wonder her own fingers had penned Polly Pettifer's tribute to him? Any woman with a beating pulse would wish to know him better. Herself included, obviously. To count him a friend and perhaps, slowly over time, see if something more might evolve. But befriending a gentleman was a far cry from matrimony, no matter how much Kendall and Lady Whipple tried to equate the two. Moreover, there was still one rather large obstacle. Well, another obstacle, in addition to Viola having never met Mr. Penn-Leith, ascertained their suitability as a couple, determined his interest in herself as a prospective wife. She placed a hand on her rambling thoughts. Swallowing, Viola lifted her eyes from the trout. "You do not consider my age to be an impediment, Lady Whipple?" Her ladyship frowned, reaching for her wine. "Why ever should it be, Miss Brodure?" Viola barely stifled a somewhat hysterical laugh. "Because at 30 years of age I passed the gates into spinsterhood an eon ago," she nearly replied, but, of course, did not. Because shyness. Her bashful tongue had always hampered her ability to converse with the opposite sex. As a younger woman, just the thought of speaking with a gentleman had sent Viola into a full-blown asthma attack. Even now, when faced with a man she admired, words caught in her mouth and her asthmatic lungs rebelled. Viola Brodure had never quite blossomed into a prize-winning rose. In fact, some might describe her as the most wallflowerish wallflower who had ever wallflowered. But after the upheaval of those days spent with Eloise last summer, Viola had realised that she needed to not only take risks in her writing, but in her personal life as well. And so, in an effort to no longer live adjacent to life, she had put her admiration of Mr. Penn-Leith into the mouth of one of her characters. And if Mr. Penn-Leith replied to her indirect compliments, Viola had reasoned, then she could respond back. From there, a dialogue could ensue, a comfortable, written communication of ideas between like-minded people. That had been her sole intention, to secure a pen pal, a charming, literary Scottish pen pal, whose dashing appearance regularly caused even London's finest roses to swoon, but still. Then Polly Pettifer had become a runaway success. It was already on to its second printing. And, in light of the novel's popularity and Mr. Penn-Leith's fame, a London gossip rag had seized on Viola's homage to him and constructed a narrative. Viola Brodure and Ethan Penn-Leith were destined to fall in love and marry. Heaven help her. Kendall, of course, had picked up the narrative thread as a means to fuel his own political ambitions. He intended to harness Mr. Penn-Leith's fame and the elevated popularity of Miss Brodure's work to garner public support against amending the callous Poor Laws. Her cheeks pinked and her breathing constricted further at the thought. "What say you to September for the wedding, Aunt?" Kendall asked Lady Whipple, cutting his trout into neat, square pieces. "It would be the perfect culmination of the parliamentary session, and could buttress my defence of our current laws for assisting the poor." Viola all but squirmed at his Grace's comment, his aims being the precise opposite of her own. Unfortunately, in the 8 months since those pivotal weeks in Manchester, Viola had found paltry few ways to express her views to the Empire's masses. After all, her father's employment as vicar of Westacre depended entirely upon the patronage of Kendall, a man who preferred to stoppeth his ears at the cry of the poor, as Proverbs so eloquently put it. Viola found it a terrible disappointment. The new Duke had spent most of his formative years away from Hawthorne and Westacre, so she had been cautiously hopeful that his political opinions might not align with his grey hair. But in that she had been mistaken. Kendall most definitely displayed the politics of an elderly man, a nostalgia for eras past, an instinctual distrust of progress, and a hostility toward the working classes. All opinions he had, no doubt, inherited from his recently deceased father. Though Viola did not like speaking ill of the dead, she had nothing kind to say about the previous Duke of Kendall. He had been a convicted bigamist who had ruled his dukedom like a tyrant, that is to say, ruthless, with no tolerance for dissent. But the old Duke had been enamoured of Viola's writing, commending the humility of her characters and their praise of the upper classes. His Grace's support had been crucial to her success, and so she had adhered to writing on the topics he dictated. Consequently, the current Duke considered Viola and her novels to be an extension of his political views. Though young, Kendall was fiercely ambitious. He reportedly aimed for nothing less than the Prime Minister's seat. "Viola, dearest, you could be Virgil to Kendall's Augustus, if you so wished it," her father had remarked only the day before. So tonight, like most evenings dining at Hawthorne, was rather a fraught dance, Viola taking what rope she could, attempting to assert her own wants and needs, but constantly chafing against the tight pull of Kendall's leash. Viola gritted her teeth and poked at the trout on her plate. The fish stared belligerently back at her. "September would also be excellent for the wedding." Lady Whipple sent her nephew an approving look. "There is much groundwork still to do if we wish to stave off further erosion of the poor laws. Unfortunately, Mr. Dickens' novels have been remarkably effective at swaying public opinion against our aims." Yes, a feat Viola herself wished to emulate. "Agreed," Kendall said, tipping his glass toward Viola, "which is why we have Miss Brodure to advocate for us. It is bad enough that the Whigs managed to pass the Poor Law Amendment Act a decade past. The poor must work harder to escape their straitened circumstances, not look to the government to provide relief gratis. And now that Miss Brodure has used her pen to essentially summon Mr. Penn-Leith to her side, we can use her heightened fame to draw attention to her tales that, in turn, support our goals." "Yes." Lady Whipple nodded in approval and motioned toward Viola. "My nephew tells me that you have begun a new novel to address this very thing, Miss Brodure. An anti-Dickens novel." Viola's throat closed further. She had only given token responses to the Duke's suggestion that she write such a novel. No inspiration had come to her yet, for obvious reasons. She had plenty of ideas for stories that supported Mr. Dickens's ideas, however. Some stories she might have even written. Lady Whipple looked at her expectantly. "Yes, I hope to begin in earnest soon." Viola swallowed, prevaricating. By soon, she meant later. Much, much later. As in, most likely never. "I had hoped that you might be farther along the path by now, Miss Brodure." Kendall frowned. "We first spoke of this before Yuletide last year." Yes, and Viola had been dodging the issue since then. I am still trying to find my...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?